37 years old, and Simone Bridges had already learned the most brutal lesson love has to teach, that you can do everything right and still end up alone. Welcome back, Midnighter. Like and comment where you're watching from. If you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. Now, let's delve into Simone's story. She had kept the apartment clean, kept herself beautiful, kept her voice soft even when she wanted to scream. She had planned the wedding in her head 100 times, the flowers, the dress, the way Marcus would look at her at the end of that aisle. She had given that man 7 years. 7 years of her laughter, her body, her Saturday mornings, her absolute trust. And he had handed them all back to her in a single conversation. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where she had cooked his mother's birthday dinner 3 years in a row, and told her, with the kind of calm that only comes when someone has been rehearsing, that he was in love with someone else. Her name was Claire. Simone didn't throw anything, didn't raise her voice. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap while the life she had built quietly collapsed around her. The way a building falls when the foundation gives, not all at once but floor by floor, everything that was supposed to hold just letting go. He said he needed something different. Those 4 words followed her everywhere. Into the diner every morning when she tied her apron. Into the mirror every night when she washed her face. Into every quiet moment she hadn't yet learned how to fill. She turned them over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down, trying to find the version of herself that hadn't been enough, trying to understand what different meant when different was the only thing she'd never thought to become. 9 months had passed since that kitchen table. 9 months of double shifts and aching feet and customers who looked right through her. 9 months of her best friend Kezia telling her to get back out there, of her mother telling her God had a plan, of Simone smiling at both of them and meaning none of it. She wasn't depressed exactly. She was just hollowed, like something essential had been scooped out of her chest and she was still walking around, still functioning, still laughing at the right moments, but the echo inside her never quite went away. She had stopped believing the next good thing was coming. That was the state she was in, tired, guarded, 37 and quietly convinced that the great love of her life had already happened and failed. On the night the door to Rosie's diner swung open at 11:43 on a Tuesday, and Damien Cross walked in. If you have ever seen a man who has been somewhere that cost him something, really cost him, you know the way they carry themselves. Not arrogant, not broken, something in between, something forged. He was tall, dark, built like a man who had spent 4 years with nothing to do but push against walls. He wore a plain black jacket, dark jeans, boots that had seen weather. No jewelry, no entourage. Just himself, moving through the door like the room needed a moment to adjust to him being in it. Simone was refilling the salt shakers at the counter when she looked up. She noticed him the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm, not loudly, not with any fanfare, just a shift in something invisible that made every cell in her body quietly pay attention. She told herself it was instinct, told herself she always clocked new customers, told herself the slight catch in her breath was tiredness. She picked up a menu and walked over. Just one tonight. He looked at her then, really looked, the kind of eye contact that doesn't flinch and doesn't perform, just lands and said, "Yeah, just me." His voice was low, deliberate, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words were currency and he wasn't in the business of wasting them. Simone set the menu down and rattled off the specials without thinking. Pot roast, catfish, sweet potato pie if he wanted dessert. She had said these words 1,000 times. They came out of her mouth on autopilot while some other part of her stood very still, aware of him in a way she hadn't been aware of anyone in a very long time. He ordered coffee and the catfish, didn't look at the menu once. She walked back to the counter and told herself to stop it. He was a customer. She was a woman who had recently had her heart extracted and handed back to her without so much as a proper apology. She was not in the business of noticing anyone. She brought his food out 12 minutes later. He was sitting with his hands around his coffee mug, staring at nothing, somewhere far away behind his eyes. She set the plate down. He came back from wherever he'd been and looked up at her. "Thank you, Simone." She froze. Just for a half second. Just long enough to remember she was wearing her name tag. She exhaled quietly, smiled the smile she gave everyone, and walked away. But her heart was beating slightly faster than it had any business doing, and she stood at the counter pretending to check her order pad while she worked out why. It was the way he said her name. Not like a customer reading a tag, like he already knew it, like it was a word he had decided to handle carefully. She shook it off, or tried to. He ate slowly, unhurried, like a man who had spent a long time eating in places where you didn't get to take your time and was relearning the luxury of it. He didn't look at his phone, didn't talk to anyone, just sat in his booth and existed with a kind of self-contained stillness that Simone found herself glancing at more often than she intended to. When he was done, he stacked his dishes neatly to the edge of the table, left his napkin folded. She came over with the check. He pulled out a fold of cash, real cash, rubber-banded, the kind of money that doesn't come with receipts, peeled off several bills without counting them, set them on top of the check, and slid it toward her. "Keep it." She looked down. $200 for a $14 meal. When she looked up to say something, anything, he was already standing, already buttoning his jacket, already moving toward the door with that same unhurried, inevitable stride. "Have a good night, Simone." And then he was gone. She stood there for a moment holding $200 and the ghost of her own name in a stranger's voice. Kezia was going to ask her tomorrow if anything interesting happened at work, and for the first time in 9 months, Simone wasn't going to say no. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know where he came from or what he'd done or what the city that made him looked like. Didn't know that the man who had just walked out of her diner had a body count attached to his reputation and a loyalty that ran so deep his crew would die before they let him fall. She didn't know any of it. All she knew was that, for the first time since Marcus sat down at that kitchen table and rearranged everything she thought her life was going to be, for the first time in 9 long, hollow months, Simone Bridges had felt something. And she had absolutely no idea what to do with that. 9 months of surviving had made Simone very good at pretending she wasn't looking for anything. She had built a comfortable numbness around herself the way you board up a window after a storm, not because the storm is coming back, but because the glass is already gone and the wind gets in anyway. She moved through her days with a kind of efficient grace that people mistook for contentment. The diner at 6, apron on by 6:15, smile loaded and ready by the time the first customer walked through the door. It was not happiness exactly, but it was structure, and structure was the closest thing to peace she had managed to find. She told herself she wasn't thinking about him. She said it to herself Tuesday night when she drove home and caught herself replaying the way he'd looked at her. Not with want, not with the lazy entitlement she was used to from men in diners at midnight, but with something quieter and far more unsettling, something that felt almost like recognition. She said it Wednesday morning while she restocked the sugar dispensers and kept one eye on the door without admitting to herself that she was keeping one eye on the door. She said it Thursday while Kezia sat across from her on break, eating a grilled cheese and talking about some man from her gym, and Simone nodded in all the right places while a stranger's voice said her name over and over in the back of her mind. She was absolutely thinking about him. The thing about being broken open by someone who was supposed to love you is that it doesn't just take the relationship. It takes your confidence in your own instincts. It takes the easy, unquestioned belief that what you feel is trustworthy, that your body and your heart and your gut are working together towards something real. Marcus had not just left her. He had made her a stranger to herself, had made every feeling she had afterward feel like potential evidence of her own poor judgment. So when something moved in her chest on Tuesday night, her first response was not to follow it. Her first response was to cross-examine it, to ask herself what she thought she was doing and whether she had learned absolutely nothing. She had learned plenty, that was the problem. She had learned that love doesn't warn you, that it arrives in ordinary moments. A kitchen table, a diner booth, a man ordering catfish without looking at the menu, and that by the time you realize something has shifted, it has already been shifting for longer than you knew. She had learned that the heart doesn't file paperwork before it makes its decisions. It just decides, quietly in the background, while you're busy telling yourself you're fine and you're healed and you are not. You are absolutely not watching the door. Friday night he came back. Same booth, same time. 11:40 something, the diner half empty. The overhead lights doing that late-night flicker they'd been doing since September that the owner kept saying he'd fix. Simone saw him the moment he walked in, and the moment cost her 3 seconds of standing completely still behind the counter before she recovered herself, picked up a menu out of pure muscle memory, and walked over with the same steady stride she used for every customer, her face doing the work her heart refused to do. Back again. It wasn't a question, she hadn't meant it to be. It came out somewhere between an observation and an accusation, and she watched the corner of his mouth move barely, just barely, in a way that might have been a smile if smiles were something he gave out freely, which she was already beginning to understand they were not. Good catfish. She set the menu down even though she already knew he wasn't going to look at it, pulled out her notepad, clicked her pen, stood there with the practiced neutrality of a woman who took orders for a living and was not, under any circumstances, going to let this man see that she had thought about him 3 days in a row. Coffee and the catfish again, or you feeling adventurous tonight? There was a pause, a real one. The kind that has weight to it, that means the person on the other end of it is actually considering you, actually present, not just waiting for their turn to talk. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had, level, unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove about it, and then he said, "Surprise me." She almost laughed, actually almost did. She caught it just in time, turned it into a pressed-lip professionalism, and walked back to the counter where she stood for a moment with her back to him, and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of feeling something before she shut it down and put in his order. She brought him the pot roast. He ate it the same way he ate everything, slowly, without performance, like a man who had spent time in places where meals were not something you savored, and was now quietly, deliberately taking back that particular piece of his life. She refilled his coffee twice. The second time she didn't walk away immediately. She wasn't sure why. She lingered at the edge of his booth, cloth in hand, and he looked up from his plate and just waited, the way he seemed to wait for everything, without impatience, without pressure, just open space that somehow made it easier to step into than to walk away from. She heard herself say, before she'd fully decided to, "You just get back to the city." He considered that for a moment, not evasively, more like a man being precise. "Few days ago." She nodded, didn't push. She had enough instinct left to know that this was a man whose edges you didn't lean against until he decided to let you, and she wasn't sure yet whether she wanted to be the kind of woman who waited for that. She wasn't sure about a lot of things where he was concerned. She refilled his cup, folded her cloth over her arm, and told him to let her know if he needed anything else with the same voice she used for every table. She used it less convincingly this time. He noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way his eyes tracked her as she walked away, not invasively, not the way men stared when they wanted something, but with a quiet, careful attention that felt less like interest and more like study, like he was filing her away somewhere, like she was something he intended to understand. It unnerved her. It also, in a place she was not ready to examine out loud, did something else entirely. His name was Damien. She found that out by accident. One of the line cooks, Rodney, who knew everyone in that city the way only a man who had lived there his whole life and never once tried to leave could know everyone, came out from the back to grab something from the counter, glanced at booth 4, and went very still for just a half-second before he carried on like nothing had happened. Later, when Damien was gone, Rodney leaned against the counter beside her and said, quietly, without drama, "You know who that is." She said she didn't. Rodney was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't hesitation but something closer to respect, or maybe the particular caution of a man who understands that some names carry weight, and you don't just toss them around in fluorescent lighting over a diner counter at midnight. Then he said, "That's Damien Cross," and left it at that, like the name itself was a complete sentence, like it explained something she hadn't known she needed explaining. She looked it up when she got home. She didn't find much. A few old articles, vague and careful in the way journalism gets when the subject is connected enough that nobody wants to be specific. She found enough to understand that Damien Cross was not a man who lived inside the lines of anything, that his name meant something in certain parts of the city. That 4 years ago he had gone away, and the city had rearranged itself slightly in his absence, the way a room rearranges itself around a missing piece of furniture. Everyone aware of the space, nobody quite saying so out loud. She put her phone down, stared at her ceiling. She thought about Marcus, who had been safe and ordinary, and had left her for a woman named Claire without a single moment of apparent conflict. She thought about 7 years of doing everything right and still ending up alone at 37 with her name tag, and her double shifts, and her hollowed-out chest. She thought about what it meant that the first person to make her feel anything in 9 months was a man whose name made a line cook go still in the middle of a Tuesday night. She thought about how he said her name. She turned off the light, told herself to be sensible, told herself she was not a woman who romanticized dangerous men, that she was older than that, wiser than that, had paid for that particular lesson in full, and did not need a refresher course. She pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes and was absolutely, completely, thoroughly unconvinced by every single word of it. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Each time he took the same booth. Each time he ordered without looking at the menu. Each time the conversation between them grew by only a small amount, a question here, an answer there, nothing that could be called disclosure, nothing that could be called anything yet, but the small amounts were accumulating. She knew he'd grown up 2 neighborhoods over, knew he didn't sleep well, knew he took his coffee black, and that when she made a dry observation about a difficult customer, he didn't laugh exactly, but his eyes changed in a way that was better than laughing. She knew that he always faced the door. She knew that he watched the room without appearing to watch the room. She knew, in the way that you know things about people before you have language for it, that this man had spent a very long time existing in spaces where safety was not guaranteed, and that the vigilance had simply become part of his architecture. She knew that he looked at her differently than he looked at everything else. Not with softness, not yet, that wasn't the right word for it, but with a kind of deliberate focus that felt, in its own strange way, like being chosen. Like out of every moving thing in the room she was the one his attention had decided to settle on, and it had made that decision carefully, and it did not appear to be reconsidering. She didn't know what to do with that. She had spent 9 months being invisible to the man who was supposed to love her, and now here was this stranger. This complicated, dangerous, quietly devastating stranger, looking at her like she was the only thing in the room worth the trouble of seeing. It was inconvenient. It was terrifying. It was the most alive she had felt in almost a year. The night everything shifted between them started like every other night, her apron, her order pad, the low hum of the diner settling into its late rhythm. It was a Saturday, which meant they were busier than usual, which meant Simone was moving fast, which meant she almost didn't notice when the man at the bar grabbed her arm. He was drunk. Not sloppy drunk, but mean drunk, the kind that picks a target and decides it's a game. He'd been making comments for an hour, small ones, incremental, the kind of harassment that dares you to overreact. When she set his bill down and turned to leave, he wrapped his hand around her wrist and said something that she would not repeat later, not to Kezia, not to anyone, something that made her skin go cold and her jaw go tight. She was already pulling her arm back, already assembling her response, already calculating the precise degree of firmness required to handle this without it escalating, when the man let go. Not because she'd pulled hard enough, because something in the atmosphere of the room had changed. Because Damien Cross was standing 2 feet away with his eyes on the man at the bar, and he was not touching anyone, and he was not raising his voice, and he was not doing anything that could be called a threat in any court of law, and every single person in the immediate vicinity understood with complete clarity that this was the most dangerous moment of that man's evening. Damien didn't speak, he just stood there. The man at the bar looked at him for about 4 seconds. Then he put 2 20s on the counter, stood up slowly with the exaggerated casualness of someone trying very hard to save face, and walked out of the diner without finishing his drink. Simone stood with her wrist against her chest and watched him go, and then looked at Damien, who was already looking at her, checking, she realized, not for gratitude, just checking, making sure she was all right. "You okay?" 2 words, low and quiet, nothing performed about them. She let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she realized, and something in her chest loosened the way it does when you've been braced for so long you forgot you were bracing. She nodded. Then, because she was Simone and Simone did not do well with being looked after without acknowledging it honestly, she said, "You didn't have to do that." He held her gaze for a moment, then simply, "Yeah, I did." She felt that answer in places she wasn't prepared to examine in the middle of a dinner rush in a fluorescent-lit diner on a Saturday night. She cleared her throat, thanked him with a professionalism that fooled neither of them, went back to work. Moved through the rest of her shift with a kind of electric awareness of exactly where in the room he was at every moment, and when her shift ended at 1 and she untied her apron and pulled on her coat, she was not surprised. She was not surprised at all, when he was still there, coffee cold in front of him, waiting. She walked over, he stood without being asked. "I'll walk you to your car." She should have said she was fine. She should have said she'd been walking herself to her car for years and wasn't in need of an escort. She looked at him for a moment, at this man she didn't fully know, who carried a name that made people careful, who had just stood down a drunk with nothing but his presence, and she said, "Okay." They walked out into the night air together, and the city was doing what it always did at 1 in the morning, breathing slow, lights amber, the occasional car moving through the dark like something unhurried and inevitable. Her car was half a block down. They walked it without rushing, without talking much. At some point during the half-block, the space between them had closed slightly, not dramatically, just enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, aware of his stride matching hers without effort, aware of herself not minding. She stopped at her car, turned to face him. He was looking at her again, that way. And she was tired of pretending it didn't mean anything, tired of interrogating every feeling before it was allowed to exist, tired of the 9 months and the kitchen table and the name Claire, and all the ways she had convinced herself that this, all of this, was beyond her now. Their hands brushed. Neither of them moved away. Just a moment, just a stillness, her hand and his in the cold night air, the city moving around them like it had nothing to say about any of it. She looked up at him and he looked at her, and the distance between them was nothing, and the distance between them was everything. And Simone Bridges, who had stopped believing the next good thing was coming, stood in the amber light outside a diner, and felt the next good thing arriving and was absolutely terrified. "Good night, Damien." She said his name for the first time. She hadn't planned to. She watched something in his expression move, small, contained, but real, and he stepped back, just slightly, giving her back the space between them like a man who understood the difference between pursuing and pressuring, like a man who had decided she was worth the patience of letting her come to this herself. "Good night, Simone." She got in her car, drove 4 blocks before she had to pull over because her hands were shaking, not with fear, not with grief, not with any of the feelings she had become so exhausted by over the last 9 months. They were shaking with something she had nearly forgotten the texture of. Something warm. Something that started small, right in the center of her chest and was already, God help her, beginning to grow. The night Damien Cross first touched Simone Bridges, it wasn't planned, and it wasn't gentle, and neither one of them pretended it was anything other than what it was. Inevitable. It had been 3 weeks of booth 4 and cold coffee and conversations that grew by inches. 3 weeks of hands brushing and eyes holding a moment too long, and Simone driving home with her heart doing things she didn't have vocabulary for yet. 3 weeks of both of them circling something neither one had said out loud. It was a Thursday when he asked her to have dinner with him. Not at the diner, somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't her apron and his booth and the performance of professionalism they'd both been hiding behind. She said yes before she'd finished deciding to. She wore a burgundy dress she hadn't touched since before Marcus, since before the kitchen table and the name Claire and all the wreckage that came after. She stood in her bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long moment, 37, full-figured, beautiful in a way she had spent 9 months forgetting, and she put on her earrings and she went. He was already there when she arrived, standing outside the restaurant, not on his phone, just present, watching for her. When she walked up, he looked at her the way men look when they've been waiting for something, and it turns out to be even better than they'd prepared for, like the air went out of him quietly, just for a second, before he got it back. "You look incredible." He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without the performance of flattery, just the plain, weighted truth of it, and it landed in her chest like something she'd been hungry for without knowing she was starving. She smiled, a real one, one that reached everything. "Thank you, Damien." Dinner was easy in the way that only happens when two people have already done the hard work of seeing each other, when the small talk is already behind you, and what's left is just the pleasure of being in the same space without pretense. He asked about her life before the diner, before the city, and she told him more than she intended to. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without his attention wandering for a single second. She asked about prison. She didn't soften the word. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her, not everything, not the parts that belonged to darkness, but enough. Enough for her to understand what 4 years of that does to a person. Enough for her to understand that the stillness in him wasn't coldness. It was what survival looks like when it hardens into character. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand, then up at her. And the thing that moved across his face in that moment was so unguarded, so briefly, entirely unprotected, that she felt the privilege of it like a physical thing, like she had been trusted with something he did not let many people near. They stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty. The walk to her apartment was slow, unhurried, his hand finding her somewhere in the first block and neither of them commenting on it, just walking through the amber city night with their fingers laced together like it was something they'd always done. She could feel the warmth of him through the cold air, could feel the solid, certain weight of his hand around hers, could feel herself leaning into the reality of him in a way she had promised herself she would be careful about. She had stopped caring about careful somewhere around the second block. At her door she turned to face him. The hallway light was low. He was close, not pressing, not taking anything, just close, in the way of a man who knows exactly what he wants and has decided the wanting is hers to meet on her own terms. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his face in both her hands, and she kissed him. He went still for just a breath, one single second of stillness. And then he kissed her back, and it was deep and slow, and so certain that her back met the door without either of them fully deciding it. His hands at her waist like they belonged there, like they had always known exactly where to go. When they finally broke apart, she was breathing differently. He rested his forehead against hers. His hands were still at her waist, warm through the fabric of her dress, and she had her palms flat against his chest and could feel his heart, steady, fast, real, and they stayed like that for a moment in the low light with the city moving quietly somewhere outside. Both of them understanding that something had just changed that was not going to change back. "Come inside," she said. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reckless. It was the decision of a woman who had spent 9 months being afraid of her own feelings and had just run out of reasons to keep being afraid. He looked at her checking, the way he always checked, making sure, and she held his gaze and nodded once, and he followed her in. What happened between them that night was not timid. It was two people who had both been through enough to know what real feels like, who had both been lonely in ways that go too deep for ordinary conversation, finally in the same room with nowhere to be and nothing to perform. She had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted completely, not conveniently, not partially, not as an afterthought, and he made her remember with a patience and an intensity that undid her in ways she hadn't known she needed undoing. He was tender where she didn't expect tenderness, consuming where she needed to be consumed. She fell asleep with his arm across her waist, and the city quiet outside her window and the feeling fragile, new, terrifying in the best possible way, that something in her that had been dark for a very long time had just quietly come back on. He was still there when she woke up. She had half expected him to be gone, expected the version of this where the morning is cold and the other side of the bed is empty, and you're left alone with the evidence of your own hopping. But he was there, awake before her, lying on his back looking at the ceiling with that private, faraway expression she was beginning to recognize as his thinking face. He turned his head when she stirred, looked at her. And the smile that moved across his face, slow, private just for her, was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man who showed the world almost nothing. She pressed her face into his shoulder and felt something settle in her bones that she hadn't felt in so long, she'd almost stopped missing it. She felt safe. Not safe like nothing bad could happen. Safe like whatever happened, she wasn't going to be alone in it anymore. She didn't know yet how much she was going to need that. The call came at 2 in the morning. Simone was asleep when her phone lit up the nightstand, not Damien's ringtone, but one of his crew, a quiet man named Rel who she'd met twice, and who did not call people at 2 in the morning unless something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't wait until morning. She was already pulling on her clothes before he finished the first sentence. He gave her an address, a warehouse on the east side, the kind of neighborhood where nobody asked questions about what happened behind which doors. She drove there with her hands steady on the wheel and her heart doing something loud and irregular in her chest, telling herself the whole way that he was okay, that Rel had said he was okay, that okay meant okay. He was not entirely okay. Damien was sitting on a crate when she got there, jacket off, a makeshift compress held against his side by a man she didn't recognize. There was blood, more than she was prepared for, dark and real against the white of the cloth, and he looked up when she walked in with that expression she was learning to hate, the one that was already trying to reassure her before she'd even reached him. "It's not as bad as it looks." She said nothing, pushed the other man's hand aside gently, lifted the compress, looked at the wound with clear eyes and a jaw so tight it ached. She had grown up watching her grandmother, A woman who had raised 4 boys in a neighborhood not unlike this one, handle emergencies with a particular brand of love that didn't have room for panic. Simone had inherited that. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She turned to Rel and told him exactly what she needed: clean cloth, hot water, a needle and thread if they had it, and something strong for him to drink that wasn't for recreation. She worked by a single work light with her sleeves pushed up and her hands steady. Damien watched her face the entire time. She could feel it, that particular quality of his attention, the weight of it, even while she focused on what her hands were doing. She cleaned the wound with a thoroughness that made him exhale sharply once through his teeth, and she didn't apologize for it because this was not the moment for apologies. This was the moment for making sure he didn't get an infection and die in a warehouse on the east side at 2 in the morning. "You're going to feel this part," she said. "I can take it." "I know you can." She looked up at him briefly. "I'm telling you anyway." She worked the needle through with a precision that surprised even her grandmother's hands moving through hers, and Damien sat completely still throughout, not performing toughness, just genuinely, constitutionally still, his eyes on her face, his breathing controlled and deliberate. When she was done, she tied it off, pressed a clean cloth over it, and sat back on her heels. The warehouse was quiet. Rel and the others had given them space without being asked, had drifted to the far end of the building with the particular discretion of men who understood which moments didn't belong to them. Damien reached out and wrapped his hand around her wrist. She looked up at him. His eyes were dark and completely serious and very, very close. "Why aren't you running?" She held his gaze, didn't look away. She had thought about this question in advance, had known, somewhere in the part of her that had already accepted what she was walking into when she pulled on her clothes at 2 in the morning, that it would come. She had known what her answer was before she knew the question. "Because you called me instead of anyone else." The silence after that was enormous and quiet and full. He looked at her for a long moment, that unguarded, briefly unprotected look she'd only seen a handful of times, the one that cost him something to show, and then he pulled her toward him slowly, carefully, mindful of his side, and she went. And she let him hold her there in the work light of a East Side warehouse at 2 in the morning with blood on her hands and her heart wide open. She pressed her face against the good side of his chest, felt his heartbeat, steady, real, stubborn. His arms tightened around her. "I'm not easy, Simone." His voice was low, not a warning, more like the last honest thing he needed to say before he stopped trying to protect her from choosing him. "You know that." She tilted her head up and looked at him. "Marcus was easy," she said. "Look how that turned out." Something moved through his expression that was almost a laugh, the closest thing she'd seen to one, and he pressed his mouth to her forehead and held it there. And she closed her eyes and felt the warehouse and the city, and all the complicated, dangerous, beautiful wreckage of this man settling around her like something she had somehow, impossibly, been waiting her whole life to walk into. She drove him to her apartment because she wasn't leaving him in a warehouse. He didn't argue. She suspected he didn't want to. She got him settled, checked the stitching one more time, made him drink water and eat something small even though it was almost 4 in the morning. And then she lay beside him in the dark with her hand resting lightly over the uninjured side of his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing slow as he moved toward sleep. She stayed awake a little longer. She thought about Marcus. She thought about safe choices and careful living, and 7 years of doing everything right and still ending up alone. She thought about the kind of life that fits inside the lines, clean, predictable, insured. And she thought about this man beside her, this complicated, dangerous, quietly devastating man who had walked into her diner and looked at her like she was worth seeing. She thought about 2 in the morning and steady hands, and the way he'd said her name in that warehouse like it was the only thing grounding him. She stopped thinking about Marcus entirely. The Vega Syndicate didn't send a warning. That was the thing about them. The thing Damien had told her in pieces. In the careful, rationed way he shared anything about the life. They didn't believe in warnings. Warnings were courtesy, and courtesy implied respect, and the Vega crew had decided long before Damien got out that his absence was their opportunity, and his return was their problem. They made that problem known on a Wednesday. Two of Damien's men, brothers named Cal and Jerome, who Simone had cooked breakfast for twice on Sunday mornings when the crew gathered at Damien's place, were jumped 3 blocks from their own corner. Cal made it out walking. Jerome didn't walk out at all, and for 6 hours nobody knew which way that was going to go until the hospital said it was going to go the right way. And those 6 hours were the longest of Simone's life, because she spent them watching Damien's face and understanding for the first time what this world actually cost. He didn't rage. That was what frightened her most. She had expected anger, loud, visible, the kind that breaks things and makes noise and at least gives you something to track. What she got instead was silence, a coldness that moved into him like weather, settling behind his eyes, restructuring something in his posture. He sat at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw set, and said absolutely nothing for a long time. And she understood that she was watching a man shift from one mode of existing into another, and that the man on the other side of that shift was not someone she had met yet. She made coffee, put a cup in front of him, sat across from him. She didn't tell him to let it go, didn't tell him to be careful, didn't perform the anxiety she felt because she understood instinctively that this was not a moment for her feelings. This was a moment to be solid, to be present, to be the thing in his life that didn't waver when everything else was shaking. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "You should stay somewhere else for a few days." She met his eyes. "No." His expression tightened. "Simone." "Damien." Her voice was quiet and completely immovable. "No." He looked at her for a long moment, that assessing, serious look, and she held it without flinching, and something in him that had been braced against her resistance slowly, almost imperceptibly, released. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything else about her leaving. What happened over the next 72 hours she only knew in pieces. Damien was in and out, moving through the apartment at odd hours, phone calls taken in the other room with the door half closed, Rel and 2 others cycling through at intervals with the quiet efficiency of men executing a plan that had been made before she was awake. She asked no questions. She kept the kitchen stocked. She slept on her side of the bed and felt the cold of his absence in the small hours and lay there listening to the city and waiting for his key in the lock. He always came back. On the 3rd night he came back wrong. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of his footsteps, slightly uneven, the pause at the door that was a beat too long. She was off the bed before he'd finished closing it behind him. The hallway light caught him, and she saw the shoulder first, the jacket dark with it, the way he was holding himself slightly off-center, protecting the right side. "Sit down," she said. "I'm Damien." She was already moving to the bathroom, already pulling the kit she had assembled after the warehouse because she was a woman who learned from experience. "Sit down." He sat. The bullet had gone clean through. That was the word he used, clean, like there was a version of being shot that qualified as tidy. And she supposed in context it was the better outcome, but her hands still shook for the first 3 seconds before she made them stop. She worked. He watched her face. "It's done," he said quietly while her hands moved over his shoulder. "The Vega situation, it's handled." She didn't ask what handled meant. She had made her peace with the doors she wasn't going to open, the questions she wasn't going to ask, the particular mercy of not knowing certain things completely. "Jerome is going to be okay," she said instead. "Yeah. And Cal?" "Cal's fine." A pause. "They're both fine." She finished cleaning the wound, pressed the dressing down, let her hands rest on his shoulders for a moment, both of them gently, just resting there, and she felt him exhale underneath her palms, felt the enormous held tension of 3 days release through him like something finally allowed to leave. She came around to face him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, head slightly bowed, looking up at her from under his brow with an expression she had no single word for, exhausted and grateful and something deeper. Something that had been building since a diner booth and $200, and a man who said her name like he already knew it. She took his face in her hands. He closed his eyes. She felt him lean into her palms the way a person leans into warmth when they have been cold for a very long time. Not desperately, not with the performance of need, but with the slow, trusting weight of someone who has finally, after a long time of not being sure it was allowed, let themselves have something good. "You came back," she whispered. "Told you I would." She leaned down and kissed him, carefully, slowly, mindful of what he was carrying, and he kissed her back with a tenderness that contradicted everything the last 3 days had been, his good hand coming up to rest against her face like she was something precious, like she was the thing he'd been holding the image of through all of it. She helped him to bed, lay beside him in the dark. He was asleep within minutes, the deep, crashed sleep of a body that had been running on adrenaline for 3 days and had finally been given permission to stop. She lay on her side facing him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest in the city light coming through the curtains, watching him sleep with the particular ache of a woman who understands she is already too far in to pretend otherwise. She was in love with him. She hadn't said it yet, hadn't planned when she would, but it was there, full and certain and slightly frightening in the way that real things are frightening, the way anything that actually matters carries that particular weight of what you stand to lose. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder, the good one. He stirred slightly in his sleep. His hand found hers in the dark, automatic, instinctive, like even unconscious he knew where she was and wanted the connection confirmed. She laced her fingers through his and closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved through its dark hours, indifferent and relentless. Inside, in the quiet of her bedroom, something that had started in a diner booth with cold coffee and $200 had grown into something neither of them had words for yet. But both of them, in their separate silences, had already decided they were not letting go of. The money came in on a Tuesday at 11:47 in the morning. Simone was at the diner when her phone buzzed against her apron pocket. 4 words, no context. No explanation, and those 4 words were enough to make her excuse herself to the back, stand in the narrow hallway beside the stockroom with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and breathe. "Come home, it's time." She untied her apron, told her manager it was a family emergency. It wasn't a lie. He was at her kitchen table when she got there, laptop open, phone face down, a stillness around him that was different from his usual stillness, charged with something electric and final and enormous. He looked up when she walked in. And the look on his face, Damien Cross, who showed the world almost nothing, who kept everything behind that lockjaw composure like a man who had learned early that visibility was vulnerability, was open in a way she had only seen a handful of times, each one a privilege she didn't take lightly. He turned the laptop to face her. She looked at the number on the screen for a long time, long enough for it to stop being abstract, long enough for it to become real, to take shape, to become the specific architecture of a life completely different from the one she was standing inside of, different from the diner and the double shifts and the apartment and the city that had given her Marcus and heartbreak and a hollowed-out chest. $11.2 million. She looked up at him. "It's clean," he said. "Crypto, untraceable, already moving through 3 different wallets." A pause. "It's done, Simone, all of it." His voice dropped. "I'm done." She heard everything living inside that last sentence. Not just the money, not just the exit, but the weight of everything being laid down. The 4 years inside. The Vega situation. The warehouse at 2 in the morning with blood on her hands. The shoulder wound and the 3 days of cold sheets and listening for his key in the lock. Cal and Jerome. All of it, the entire dangerous, complicated, costly architecture of the life he had built and survived and carried, set down. Her eyes filled. She didn't let it spill. She just looked at him and let him see everything moving across her face because he had earned the right to see it. "Where are we going?" she asked. Something broke open in his expression, slow, luminous, the smile of a man who had spent a very long time not being sure he would get to have this and was now, finally, holding it in both hands. "Italy," he said. "Naples. I found a place on the water." She laughed. It came out wet and overwhelmed and completely real, and he looked at her like it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. "I've never been to Italy." "I know." He stood, came around the table, put his hands on her face the way she had put her hands on his after the warehouse, after the shoulder, after every hard thing, with the tenderness of a man who has decided someone is worth every careful thing he has in him. "You're going to love it." She covered his hands with hers. "Tell me you're sure." "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." No decoration, no performance, just the plain, weighted truth of him, the way he had always spoken to her from the very first night. "You are the only thing I have ever been completely sure of." She kissed him. He held her like she was the answer to something he had been asking in silence for years. They had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to become different people on paper, new names, clean histories, the particular quiet magic of enough money, and the right connections applied to the problem of disappearing completely. Damien moved through it with a focused efficiency that reminded her he had been building toward this exit long before she was part of the plan, and she followed his lead, packing her life into one bag with a ruthlessness that surprised her. She found it easier than expected to leave things behind when what she was walking toward felt like this. She called her mother the night before they left. She didn't say where she was going, said only that she was okay, that she was happy, that she was with someone who looked at her like she was worth looking at. Her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, in the way of mothers who understand more than they are told, "Baby, I can hear it in your voice." Simone looked across the apartment at Damien, one lamp on against the dark, checking something on his phone with that focused stillness she had fallen in love with in a diner booth over cold coffee. She said, "I know, Mama, I know." The night before the flight, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and took inventory not of what she was leaving but of what had built this moment. A broken engagement, a kitchen table, a diner booth at 11:43 on a Tuesday, $200 and a man who said her name like he already knew it, a warehouse and steady hands, a threaded needle and "Why aren't you running?" A shoulder wound and 3 days of waiting, and now a number on a screen and 4 words on a phone and Italy. She turned her head, looked at him in the dark. "You awake?" she said. "Yeah." City dark quiet settled between them for a moment. "You scared?" she asked. He was still for a beat. Then, with the particular honesty that was the most intimate thing he knew how to offer, "Of losing you, of losing this." A pause. "Nothing else scares me anymore." She moved into him. His arms came around her immediately, automatically, the way they always did, like her place against his chest was something his body had memorized and didn't need to think about. "You're not going to lose me," she said. "I know," his mouth pressed against her hair. "That's the only reason I sleep at all." She closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved through its last night of being theirs, amber lights and distant traffic, and the specific restless sound of a place that had held them and hurt them, and in the end, given them each other. She listened to it without sadness, said goodbye to it without grief, Some places you outgrow not because they failed you, but because you have finally grown into something they cannot contain. They left at 6 in the morning. Simone took one look back at the building as the car pulled away, deliberate, complete, a proper closing, and then she faced forward. Damien drove with one hand on the wheel, and one hand holding hers the entire way to the airport. They were somewhere over the Atlantic, the ocean black and vast below them, when she fell asleep against his shoulder. She dreamed of water, warm and blue and endlessly open, and in the dream she was not afraid of how deep it went. She woke to him watching her. That look, that private, specific, completely for her look that had started everything on a Tuesday night in a fluorescent-lit diner when she was 37 and hollowed out, and had stopped believing the next good thing was coming. She smiled before she was fully awake. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, said nothing, didn't need to. Below them, the ocean carried them forward through the dark, away from everything they had survived, toward everything they had chosen, and neither one of them looked down. They landed in Naples at dawn. The beach house in Naples sat on a cliff above the Tyrrhenian Sea. White walls, terracotta floors, a terrace that caught the morning light and held it like something precious, like the sun had decided this particular ledge of the Italian coast was worth lingering on. Bougainvillea climbing the south wall in cascades of deep pink that Simone had spent the first week just standing in front of, unable to explain to herself why something so simple kept making her eyes fill. She had never lived anywhere beautiful before, not like this. 3 years had passed the way good years pass, not quickly exactly, but fully, each day dense with living, with the particular richness of a life chosen deliberately by two people who understood what the alternative looked like. The new names, the first months of learning Italy together, the language, the rhythms, the way Neapolitans moved through their days with a relationship to time that had no American equivalent. All of it had settled slowly into something that felt not like hiding but like arrival. Like they had been trying to get here all along without knowing it. Damien had changed in the way that only peace changes a man who has never had it. The vigilance was still there, written too deep to fully unlearn, but it had softened at the edges, had lost the cold, particular quality it carried in the city when the streets had a claim on him. He slept, actually slept long and heavy, and without the hair-trigger wakefulness of his first months out of prison. He had learned enough Italian to argue cheerfully with the man who sold fish at the market 2 streets over, and the fish vendor argued back with equal warmth, and they had become friends in the way of men who respect each other's stubbornness. He was happy. She had never seen him happy before. It was devastating in the best possible way. Luca arrived 11 months after Naples. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, loud from the very first second, with Damien's jaw and Simone's eyes, and a personality that he had apparently assembled in the womb and intended to impose on the world at full volume. Damien had held him in the delivery room with the careful, almost frightened reverence of a man confronting something that exceeds every category he has prepared for. Simone watched his face in that moment and understood that whatever Damien Cross had been before, whatever the streets had made him, whatever prison had hardened, whatever darkness had lived behind those eyes in the diner on that first Tuesday night, all of it had just been permanently rearranged by 7 pounds and 4 ounces of brand new human. He cried he didn't know she saw. She saw. Now Luca was too ferocious and sun-brown, and obsessed with the sea in the way of children who have grown up within sound of it, who understand water not as something to fear, but as something that belongs to them. He spent his mornings running barefoot across the sand below the terrace, chasing birds he would never catch, narrating everything he did in a chaotic mixture of English and Italian that made the neighbors smile and made Simone's chest ache with a sweetness she had no adequate word for. She was watching him from the terrace when Damien came up behind her. She felt him before she heard him, the warmth of him, the familiar gravity, and then his arms came around her waist from behind, and his chin found her shoulder, and they stood together watching their son career across the beach below, his laughter carrying up to them on the salt air. She put her hands over his. They stayed like that for a long moment, the sea glittering out to the horizon, Luca a small, joyful, unstoppable thing on the sand below, the bougainvillea moving in the warm wind at the edge of the terrace. "He's going to jump in," Damien said. "He's going to try," she smiled. "He always tries." A pause, the good kind, the kind that has nothing in it that needs filling. "Simone." "Him." His arms tightened slightly. His voice was low and close and completely serious. "I need you to know something." She turned her head. He was right there, his face level with hers, his eyes, those eyes that had tracked her across a fluorescent-lit diner on a Tuesday night and changed the entire direction of her life, steady and open and full. "When I walked into that diner," he said, "I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't capable of looking for anything. I was just trying to remember how to be a person again." A pause. "And then there you were." She felt her throat tighten. "There I was," she said softly. "There you were," his mouth curved, "telling me the specials like you hadn't just walked into the best moment of my life." She laughed. It came out the same way it always had with him, wet and real and completely unguarded. She turned in his arms and faced him and put her hands on his chest over his heart, feeling it beat under her palms the way she had felt it beat in a warehouse and a bedroom and an airplane over the Atlantic, and now here, on a terrace above the sea, steady and stubborn and entirely hers. "I thought love was over for me," she said. "I genuinely believed I had used up my portion of it. And now—" She looked at him, at this man who had walked into her diner with prison still in his posture and $200 in his pocket and a name that made people careful. This man who had stood down a drunk with nothing but his presence and shown up at her door at 2 in the morning with nowhere else to go. This man who had let her stitch him back together in a warehouse and in a bedroom and in every quiet moment in between, and who had held their son in a delivery room and cried when he thought she wasn't watching. This man who had brought her to Italy. "Now I think love was saving itself up," she said, "waiting until I was ready for the version of it that was actually worth having." He kissed her, slow and warm and certain, with the sea behind them and Luca's voice rising from the beach below and the afternoon light turning everything gold. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and she closed her eyes and breathed him in and felt the wholeness of it, not perfect, not without scars, not without the complicated history of everything it had taken to get here, but whole. Actually, genuinely whole. Below them, Luca hit the water with a splash and a shriek of pure delight. They both looked down. Damien shook his head slowly. Simone pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed. "Told you," she said. "Every time," he said. And he was smiling, the full, unguarded, devastating version that she had spent the first weeks of knowing him wondering if she would ever see, as he watched his son stand up in the shallow water, soaked to the waist, and immediately attempt to do it again. The sun moved across the Tyrrhenian Sea. The bougainvillea swayed. The city of Naples breathed its ancient, unhurried breath somewhere behind them. And Simone Bridges, 40 years old, once hollow, once convinced that the great love of her life had already happened and failed, stood in the arms of the man who had walked into her diner and looked at her like she was worth seeing, on a cliff above the sea, in a life she could not have imagined from a kitchen table 9 months of grief ago. She had thought love was over. Love had not yet begun. And so I leave you with this, because this story, like all the ones that matter, doesn't end on a beach. It ends in a question that follows you home. How many of us have sat at our own kitchen table, our own version of that moment, and decided, quietly and without ceremony, that we had used up our portion, that the best of it was behind us, that what was coming could not possibly be worth the risk of opening back up. How many times have we chosen the safety of feeling nothing over the terrifying, beautiful, costly possibility of feeling everything? And here is the harder question, the one worth sitting with tonight. If Simone had let her heartbreak become her identity, if she had let Marcus define the edges of what she was willing to reach for, she would have walked past Damien Cross with a menu and a professional smile and never looked back. What are you walking past right now? Because you've decided you already know how the story ends. If this story moved something in you, if it sat with you the way it sat with me, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories coming that will find you exactly where you are. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe that the next chapter hasn't been written yet, and turn on your notifications so you never miss what's coming next. The best stories always begin where we least expect them. I'll see you in the next one.